Welcome students. In this video I'm going to discuss annotated bibliographies. First, let's talk about what an annotated bibliography is. The word annotated is the past tense version of the word annotate, which means to summarize. So an annotated bibliography is a summarized bibliography, and a bibliography is a list of sources. So an annotated bibliography is really just a list of sources for which you've summarized each source. The purpose of an annotated bibliography is, again, to collect and summarize sources, and also to compare sources, to spot trends among sources and different types of research, and to form a conversation among sources. In an earlier video on research papers, I talked a little bit about how the research paper is sort of a conversation between different sources. You're going to present different ideas on different sides of your argument, and you're going to sort of have this typed out conversation between sources. You know, according to so-and-so, this, but according to this person, this other thing. And so the bibliography is going to help you sort of form that conversation. And what we're looking for in an annotated bibliography is analytical summaries. So they're not just summaries where you say what's in the source, you apply some analysis to it. So you discuss what's important about it or how you might use that source. There's two parts to each entry, a bibliography line and a summary. And in the bibliography line, you're going to use APA style. I am not going to go over APA style in this video. I suggest using a service like Zotero. Zotero, here's a screenshot, is a free piece of software that you can download that will help you organize your sources. So you can see this is a screenshot of my Zotero that I put together for my thesis, my master's thesis. And so I have a folder right here for thesis, and I have all the sources listed. There are, I think, 100 sources here. And for each source, if I click on it, I see more information about that source. And when I add a source, I click this green button, and I click add, and then it asks me what kind of source it is. And you can see there's icons for the different sources. So these are journal articles. This is a book. These are newspaper articles. Not quite sure. I think that's a website with the little people on it. And so I say what kind of source this is, whether it's a journal entry or a book, what have you, and then I type in over here as much as I know about that entry. And once I've done that with my sources, I can export the bibliography. So Zotero will actually put together the entries for me, and I don't have to spend time formatting my entries in APA style. So I would suggest using a service like that. I have another video that I've added to the course Blackboard on how to use Zotero. After the bibliography line, you have a summary, and the summary itself has three parts. First, discuss the author's credentials. Why should we believe what this author is writing? Why should we care what this author has to contribute? Second, summarize the content. And again, this is an analytical summary. So you want to discuss key findings, you want to analyze what you've read, discuss key terms. Really, what you're doing in this entry is you're trying to provide enough information that when you move to writing your paper, your information is sort of all in your bibliography, so you don't have to go dig through all of your sources again. So it's really important that when you can, you include measurable data such as numbers, important passages or quotes in your summary, and names of theories that are discussed. Now, one thing that I do see sometimes is that the summary will just be a bunch of quotes from the research paper, and unfortunately that's not going to cut it for an annotated bibliography. You need to use your analytical mind to summarize what you've read in terms of what's important, what the data means, and how you can sort of get value out of this research. If you simply copy and paste lots of quotes, you're not going to earn credit because that's not an analysis. It's really not even a summary. It's just selections. And finally, in the summary, you want to explain the value of the source. So how are you going to use it? And this is where you can start to compare and contrast with other sources. So if you have a source you've looked at previously that conflicts with or disagrees with the one you're looking at now, the third part of the summary is where you mention that. And you can think about each of these sections as its own giant paragraph. Author's credentials is probably going to be the smallest paragraph, and then a giant paragraph in which you summarize the content, and then a third paragraph in which you explain how this is useful, how it compares and contrasts to other sources. There might be other sources that talk about similar terms or similar findings, so you want to bring those up in that third portion as well. If you've done an annotated bibliography correctly, then you'll sort of write your paper using the conversation that arises in your annotated bibliography. And I think I talked about this a little bit in the discussion of your research. You have this conversation going on. If you put that in your annotated bibliography, when you go to write your paper, you already have this conversation that's happening in your bibliography of how the sources work together and what it all means. So you can pull that from your annotated bibliography instead of, again, having to go back to each individual source. Now, what an annotated bibliography is not, I think, is important. It can help you think about something if you think about what it's not. An annotated bibliography is not every source that you read. Some of the sources you run into aren't going to be helpful, especially early on in your research. And this is just how research goes. As you're looking at your research question and you're trying to understand the thesis statement you're going to make, you're going to run across some research that might seem like it's what you want, but as you get further and further into your research, you'll realize some of it just isn't what you want. Some of it's just not the right topic, or it's sort of tangentially related. Or it's very old research, something like that. So I don't want an annotated bibliography from you that's literally every source you read. Every piece of the bibliography has to contribute to that conversation. It has to contribute to your knowledge on a topic. If you have a research question about sports marketing and you have a bibliography entry about Twitter and its effects on teenagers, that doesn't fit. Maybe you read it when you were doing research because you thought it might help you and then you realized later it didn't. If that's the case, it doesn't need to be in your annotated bibliography. An annotated bibliography is not single entries with nothing in common. It's really important that you look for how these resources work together. What do they have in common with each other, and what does it all add up to? It's not a list of things you didn't read. If you didn't read the research, don't put it in your annotated bibliography. If you rented a book from the library and you only read one chapter, then your entry needs to discuss only that chapter, and the APA citation needs to include the name of the chapter that you read. So don't misrepresent the work that you did. If you only read a portion of something, only discuss that portion and make it clear that you only read that portion. An annotated bibliography is not descriptive summaries. So you're not just summarizing, oh, this is a paper by so-and-so from this university, it's about Twitter, or it's about social marketing. You really need to make an analysis. You need to look for terms, you need to look for key concepts, names of theories, numbers, percentages of people who answered this or that on a survey. You want to be really specific with the information that you include. Now, I do occasionally get questions about sort of how do you organize your research, and I've mentioned Zotero, but I, for some reason, have a huge problem dealing with PDFs and digital communications. For some reason, I just can't manage them. And I've had students come to me before and they've had the same issue. So I want to show you really quickly, if you're struggling with managing your sources on your computer, what I suggest is printing them out. And I'm going to show you, this is all the research for a paper that I wrote recently, and I printed out everything. Now this is not, I didn't include books. I had maybe 10 books, but I had to give them back to the library, so they're not in my pile. But I printed out all of the research that I found online, and you can see that I color-coded it. Let me see if I can. So as I went through, I put a Post-it note on each piece that was a different color, based on what it was generally about. So I was looking at some themes in my research. Now my research was on how museums are using mobile apps. And so I did a ton of research on how museums are using mobile apps, and I started to see some themes. For example, multimedia. I saw lots and lots of research about multimedia being used in apps in museums. So any piece of research that I printed that was about multimedia, I gave it a blue Post-it note with Yellow, social, any social media that was being used in apps in museums, printed it, gave it a yellow post-it note that said social on it. You can see I've highlighted key passages, so I can put those in my annotated bibliography, or if I have too many for the annotated bibliography, at least I don't have to read this again when I need those quotes for my paper. And then here's another multimedia with blue, and then another theme that I found was wayfinding, apps that help people get around. And those were really the three major types of apps that I saw in the research. Wayfinding, multimedia, and social apps. So I printed everything out and I categorized it, and that really helped me think about how to approach all of these different pieces of research. You do not have to do this. I'm not going to ask you to turn in your categories or anything like that, but if you are a person like me who just struggles to deal with digital relics like PDFs and screenshots of research online, this might be the avenue for you. You need 20 pieces of research, so the library will accommodate that. You have enough printed pages to do that, or if you're at home, that's probably still a manageable amount if you want to print them. That's just my advice if you get a little flustered with the organization of your research. So I have a few tips before I let you go on conducting your annotated bibliography. Obviously, you want to use the correct APA citation format, and again, I suggest that you just let a computer do it for you. Get Zotero or some other service. There are some services, I think Firefox has a plugin where you can just press the button and it will look up the citation for the page you're on. Just get a computer to do it for you. You don't want to spend a bunch of time trying to figure out where the commas go and whether something's italicized. That's probably a waste of your time. You want to use correct document format, so indents, spaces, where needed, and I have an example of that coming up. Cite original sources. So I talked about this in the last video. If you have a review of research or a news article about research, find the original resource for that. Use an academic voice. This is an academic paper, so avoid me, my, I. This is not your opinion. This is your analysis. Build on prior work or review your prior work as you go, and use previous sources to find additional sources. So I'm going to go through those one by one. Use the correct document format. There's an example available on Blackboard. It's a PDF that you can download. You'll notice that the first line is not indented and the rest of the lines are indented. So make sure you use that in your format. Cite original sources. Again, find the original source instead of using the secondary source if you can. So in the book NetSmart, for example, Howard Rheingold discusses some work on Blogger Voice by Phil Agri, and here's the entry where he discusses that. This is a Kindle book, so you can actually click on the little 26 footnote and that will take you to the citations, and you can see this entry. It has the link, so if you click the link, there's the original resource. You don't want to quote Howard Rheingold quoting Phil Agri. That doesn't make sense. You want to quote the original writer. Again, use academic voice, so avoid I, me, and my. Here's a rewrite to show you the difference. If you have trouble doing this, just write it the way you want first, and then go back and get rid of I, me, and my. So in the old version, I could use their definition of freemium model to explain how streaming generates revenue. Actually, not a bad way to put it, but keep in mind you want to be able to use some of what you have in the annotated bibliography in order to write the paper. So if you just go ahead and start by writing it in an academic voice, then it's very much closer to the final research paper style of writing and less conversational. You could actually copy and paste some of this and then put it in your paper and rework it a little bit. Instead of having to completely rewrite it. So instead of saying I could use their definition to explain how streaming generates revenue, explain what that is. Explain how streaming generates revenue according to these two researchers. I could use the argument they brought up about streaming. They argue that streaming is oftentimes better quality than pirated copies. So you can take a look at this old and new example. Build on your prior work. Every time you turn your work in, include your previous work. The effect of this is that you're going to be turning in the same bibliography over and over again. And just as an example, here's a piece from a former student. There's their research question, which they turned in, and then their thesis statement, which they turned in, and then they have the annotated bibliography, and they just keep adding to that. So first they sent the research question, then they added the thesis statement, then they started adding the bibliography entries. So just keep adding and adding to the same document. Use previous sources to find new sources. If a paper really helps you, I know it's difficult sometimes to get on the right foot, to really get into a research agenda that becomes fruitful for you. So as soon as you find a paper that really helps you, look at the bibliography for it for similar sources. So this is the bibliography of a source that I found helpful. I'm going to go through that and I'm going to read the titles and see if any of these might be helpful to me as well, because they're obviously similar in nature to the source that helped me. The source that helped me looked at these, so I should look at them too. So this is a neat little trick for finding sources when you've got a few sources already that are helpful. Keep going down that path. See what was helpful to those people. And finally, I just want to remind you about the organization. An annotated bibliography is presented in alphabetical order by the last name of the author. So as you add entries each week, you're not going to just add them to the bottom. You're going to add them where they belong in the alphabetical order. Put spaces between entries so I can tell where an entry begins and where an entry ends. And then use proper formatting, again, which includes indents on all lines except for the first. So it should look like this over and over and over again. That's everything. If you have any questions about annotated bibliographies or you want me to look at yours because you've got one started, please feel free to send your questions or your draft my way and I will get back with you as soon as I can. I look forward to seeing the start of your bibliographies.